Good to see everybody this morning. I imagine that if I were to go around the room and start asking you individually, what do you think heaven will be like? We'd probably get a lot of answers, right? A lot of different answers. And I think the reason that we would get a lot of different answers is because we don't have a lot of information, do we? Scripture doesn't give us a lot of specific details regarding heaven, regarding what exactly it's going to be like. You know, we know certain things will be true or untrue about heaven, and that's kind of as far as it goes. So we may have our own speculations about what heaven would be like. But I think the best speculations regarding what heaven will be like comes from children. You ever asked a child what they think heaven is going to be like? You ever tried that before? Anybody gotten any fun answers before? Okay, here's the challenge for you. Ask the grandkids or the kids sometime. What do you think heaven's going to be like? One guy who had lactose intolerance was told by a kid, when you get to heaven, you get to finally eat all the ice cream you want. You know, because in his mind, he was blown away. How could somebody not eat ice cream? What a terrible life that would be to not be able to eat ice cream. And so heaven must mean you're going to get to eat ice cream. Another kid said that they were really excited about heaven because in heaven there's no homework. And another one said they were excited because in heaven there's no chores. So you can see what's on the minds of a child, you know, as far as comparing this life to what heaven must be like. The things that you get when you get there, or the things you don't have to deal with when you get there. Kids say some funny things when we ask them to think about life after this life. Today we're actually wrapping up this study. Today we're going to be concluding our study of life in the face of death. And as we pointed out last week, so much of what we're trying to do with this class, with this quarter, is to change our perspective, right? Our perspective on life changes dramatically if we are more conscious and more aware of our own mortality. But this morning, I want to ask you why. Why does it matter if our perspective changes at all? Okay, it would change the way you live your life. And why is that important? Okay, it would make you grasp for heaven. All right? And why is that important? Okay, you want to have the right perspective to allow you to go in the right direction rather than the wrong direction. Yes, these are all absolutely correct. And why do we need to go the right direction? To keep from going to the wrong place. Right, okay. So a change in our perspective, or at least maintaining the proper perspective, will keep us in this life going the proper direction, which also keeps us from going the wrong direction, so that the end destination remains the right one. Okay? Right? That all makes sense? All right. Hebrews 9 and verse 27. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes what? Judgment. All right? That's the point at which we're either ending up in the right place or the wrong place because we have spent time going the right direction or the wrong direction. This is ultimately, this is the point of this whole quarter, of focusing on gaining the proper perspective. It's not just that death is looming. It's not just that we need to be aware of our own mortality. Because death is not the end, is it? It's because that after death, there still awaits something for us, depending on how this life has been lived. Now, let's shift gears for just a second, and I want us to talk about the tabernacle. Now, what was the purpose of the tabernacle? Okay, all right, it was a temporary place for God while the Israelites were traveling, especially as it was first built, right? When was the tabernacle first built? Where were they? Okay, it was during Moses' time, and they were on their way to the promised land, right? So here they needed a temporary place, one that was a mobile unit for God. All right? What else was the tabernacle? Yes, this was the location of the sacrifices that were made by the priests and the high priest. All right? So that means it was also a place of what? Worship. All right? So this was a temporary, mobile place of worship and sacrifice, and it was also, as Barbara pointed out, the location of God's presence in Israel or among the Israelites. Okay? Exodus 25 is where we find the instructions regarding the construction of the temple, or I'm going to do that a lot today, I think. The tabernacle itself, okay? There's very specific instructions on how it's to be built and the size and everything. And in verse 8, it says, "And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst." All right, so this is the first thing God says about the tabernacle, that it is for God to dwell in their midst. All right. Now, in this, this is actually a model of it that was built somewhere. I can't remember where. You'll see that you have, of course, the open air portion of it that is kind of the outer portion surrounded by this fenced area. That is the place that would have the altar for most of the sacrifices and everything. It also has a place for ceremonial washing for the priests. And then you have the inner portion of the tabernacle, the covered portion that you see here. And that covered portion contained two sections. Now, do you remember what those two sections were? Okay, the holy place and the most holy place, or holy of holies, depending on what translation you're using. Okay, so there's the holy place first, right? Only the priests were going to be entering these sections of the tabernacle, right? So the holy place would contain an altar of incense, the showbread, and a golden candlestick. All right? And then the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, what was in there? The Ark of the Covenant, right? And who was allowed to enter into the most holy place? The high priest, and only the high priest, right? And how often was the high priest allowed to enter there? Once per year. What was he doing in there? Yes, yes, the sacrifice on the Day of Atonement is what would take place in the most holy place once per year. Now, the high priest himself, in preparation for that day, would spend multiple days going through multiple cleansing rituals in order to make himself holy and pure for his entering into the Holy of Holies. And when he would do so, he would also wear bells on his clothing. Why would he wear those bells? In case what? In case he died. Right? Why? Why might he die? Okay, the Ark of the Covenant is a scary thing. You've seen Indiana Jones, right? No. Okay, the Ark of the Covenant was had very strict regulations regarding who could carry it and when and how and who could ever touch it, right? So the high priest, when he would go in on the Day of Atonement, um, would have these indications so that people outside of the most holy place could tell that he was still in there moving around doing what he was supposed to be doing. But if those sounds stopped, then this would be an indication that they could then proceed as though he has died. And because there were allowances for going in if something like that had taken place. All right? One author put it this way regarding the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. God lives here, and anyone who draws near must either be holy or dead. That's the only two options. That sounds like a really exciting place to be, right? Can you imagine being the high priest and how anxious you might be going into this place once per year, into the very presence of God and the danger that exists there? And if that wasn't unsettling enough, what we read in the description of the tabernacle is that in this Holy of Holies, woven into the fabric of the tent, as well as on top of the ark itself, were what? Cherubim. Now, that should be a perfectly normal thing because cherubim are cute, chubby babies, right? No, afraid not. What are cherubim? Or, I don't know if you can answer, what are they? As much as, do you remember any descriptions that we have in Scripture of what they might look like? Okay, there's usually, the description usually includes wings. What else? Somewhat of a monstrosity of heads. What else? This is a variety of passages that say different things. It's not pretty, is it? They have weapons. They're scary. Yes. These are not normal things that we would see on a regular basis. And maybe our, 21st century sensibilities about what is or isn't scary has changed us a little bit because, we see things in movies and there's all kinds of crazy things that we've been exposed to that dulls our senses a little bit. But cherubim, as far as people at this point in history would have been concerned, were scary creatures. And they usually combine some form of human and animal characteristics. These are some artist renderings of weird things. The eyes that are all over the creature. And these features, this is a part of the tabernacle. It's kind of an uncomfortable place to be. Now you might ask, why would God make the holiest of holy places such an uninviting place? Why wasn't the central part of the tabernacle and then eventually the temple a place that could be visited by anyone and everyone? Any ideas on how to answer that? Okay, anyone and everyone had not been cleansed and purified and prepared to be in this incredibly unique and special place. And once again, let's remember, what is it that makes this such an incredibly unique and special place? It is God dwelling there. It is God's presence. So any filth of this world, of disobedience, of sin, cannot be allowed to enter. No way that could be allowed. Now, hold that thought for just a second. Let's turn to Revelation 21. And I want us to notice something here. We're going to be reading a portion of John's vision, and I want you to notice how heaven is described in the end. All right, so we're going to read Revelation 21, verses 1 through 4. If somebody will read these verses for us. Okay, now let's look at verse 3. God's what is now among the people? Dwelling place. All right, or some version of that depending on your translation. You know what word is translated dwelling place right here? It's actually tabernacle. And then it shows up in the very next phrase as well, in kind of a verb form. He is going to dwell with them. He is going to tabernacle with them. So what do you think that should tell us about life after death? Exactly, that it is God's presence. That is what is emphasized here in this grand vision. I mean, whatever your understanding and interpretation of the book of Revelation is, it is a grand, impressive, amazing vision, right? With all of its symbols and all that's going on and takes place in this vision that God gives to John, his description of heaven leans primarily on the fact that it is God's dwelling amongst us. We are in God's dwelling place. We are in the tabernacle. So what that ought to do is remind us that our hope as Christians is not built around hoping for an extension of life. And our hope is not built around fulfillment of some grand dreams like getting to eat all the ice cream we want. That's not what heaven is about. Heaven is about God's dwelling place. And it is about God dwelling amongst us in a unique way. But if eternity is God's tabernacle, then the same expectation has to apply there as it did in the original. As was stated earlier, the quote that I read, you're either holy or dead. So how do we become holy in preparation for that eternal tabernacle? Absolutely. It begins with the cross, doesn't it? After all, the Hebrews writer tells us that Jesus is our what? Our high priest. Exactly. Let's turn over to Hebrews. I want us to read a few verses here in the description of Jesus as our high priest and what that means, what his role is as our high priest. Hebrews chapter 9. And if somebody would read for us verses 11 through 14. Okay. I was thinking maybe your translation didn't have that part. Okay, now, verse 11. Jesus accomplished this by going through a better what? Tabernacle. Now, some translations, a few translations will say tent right there. English Standard Version does, but it is the word tabernacle once again. So Jesus is the only one who can accomplish what he accomplished in complete and total once and for all purification from sin. Now, that is the primary key to our ability to tabernacle with God in eternity. Because without that, we would have no hope. Remember, we spent a lot of time talking about hope this quarter. Without that sacrifice, without our high priest doing what he did, we wouldn't have a shred of hope. But that doesn't exclude us from any responsibility, does it? Because we need to acknowledge that in preparation for that time, for that tabernacle with God in eternity that takes place after death, there is responsibility in this life that we have to take. In fact, the Apostle Paul tells us that there is a temple in this life that is expected to be kept holy. And what is that temple? Our bodies. All right? 1 Corinthians 6. Let's read these verses together. First Corinthians 6. Somebody read verses 15 through 20 for us. Okay, now, in the context of what Paul is pointing us to here, he is pointing primarily to a very specific example and emphasizing that our bodies as temples, as tabernacles of God's dwelling place, we should carefully consider how we use them and avoid sins that would make this temple less than holy. Right? What else comes across your mind, though, with the idea that your body is God's temple, God's dwelling place? Okay, the things that you say, the words that you use, and how you use them to other people. Why does that come to mind for you, Tim? Right. Because you can do a lot of good or you can do a lot of bad. Yeah, that's exactly right. What else comes to mind with the idea of maintaining your body as a temple, as God's dwelling place? Okay, God is always with you. And the thing about that is we can look at that as two sides of the same coin, right? Because on the one hand, that is a great comfort, is it not? That God is always with us. If our bodies are truly His temple, His dwelling place, then He is there with us through all the ups and downs of life. He is there to help us through all the ups and downs of this life. But the other side of that same coin is, uh-oh, God is also with me all the time. And that means He's also around when I mess up. And when I am not representing Him well. When I'm not being the image of God that I need to be in this world. So we need to remember that as individuals, that our body is God's dwelling place. But there's another temple that Paul speaks of, and it's in this same letter. Do you know what it is? Okay. I was curious if you had heard this before. Let's turn to chapter 3. Shouldn't be but a couple pages, if that. I want you to notice 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. It sounds very similar to what he says in chapter 6. Do you not know that you are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. Now, here's the thing. In chapter 6, Paul says, you are the temple. And then it sounds like he's saying the exact same thing here in chapter 3. But there's something significant that is sometimes missed because of the way our English language works, unless you're from the South. If I say, you, Mark, or you, Wes, or you, Pete, or you, whoever, I mean one person, right? In the South, if I'm talking about all of you, I have a word for that, don't I? Y'all. There's not any L's, it ends with a W. Y'all. Okay, all y'all. That's what Paul says here in chapter 3. It's not a singular you. It's not saying that you as individuals are individually God's temple or temples. What he's actually saying in this chapter is all y'all in Corinth that are Christians are collectively God's singular temple. So what is the temple in this context? It's the church, right? So in addition to individually being God's temple, his dwelling place in this life, and being aware of how that affects the way that we live this life as individuals, Paul is also emphasizing the need for that recognition as the church as a whole. That the church as a whole is also God's dwelling place. Now, if you look up a little further or earlier rather, in this chapter, you may have a heading or something that gives you a clue as to why Paul might be emphasizing this in this chapter. What's going on in Corinth? Divisions. They're dividing over all kinds of things. And if you read the whole letter here to Corinth, you'll find that it's like they're trying to create ways to divide from each other. You know, they're dividing over who baptized who. They're dividing over how they take the communion. They're dividing over all kinds of things. And so on this occasion, Paul says, if you do harm to the temple, if you do harm to the church, what's going to happen to you? Bad news for you, isn't it? So by reminding the Christians in Corinth that the church is the temple as a whole, Paul is saying you cannot allow unholy things like division into the church. You cannot allow unholy things like favoritism, divisiveness, bickering, arguing, on and on and on, all these kinds of things into the church, because they are unholy. Because the church as a whole is also the image of God to the world. So as we wrap up our study of how to live this life in light of the fact that death is approaching us all, and in light of the fact that what that really means is that judgment is approaching us all, we must remember every day that we individually are God's temple, his dwelling place, and that we collectively, as the church, are God's dwelling place. What other thoughts do you have for us this morning? Yes, ma'am. Yes, absolutely. Right. Yes, you're exactly right. That is a huge challenge. I mean, and one of the interesting things, or maybe ironic things about where this information is coming from, First Corinthians. I mean, it's in chapter 5 when Paul says basically, you're acting like this is no big deal. You're almost championing the fact that you're allowing this immorality into the body of Christ. That's not the way it's supposed to be. It is a challenge. And you're right, that is a part of our individual responsibility as the collective body of Christ, the collective temple, to be sure, to be alert to and aware of immorality and unholy actions or attitudes or things that may be seeping into the church. And we have to be very aware of that and ready to, as best we can, deal with that in a loving way. Other thoughts? Yes, sir. Okay, so I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and I was reading about this a few months ago. Actually, I believe there were um, allowances for someone to go in and get him out that was not um, the high priest. That was the only exception to the rule. Is if the high priest should happen to touch the ark or something like that and collapse and die in the Holy of Holies, then they were allowed to go and get him out, because all of a sudden, you can't just allow a dead body in the most holy place, an unclean dead body. They've got to do something about that. I think that was the only exception to the rule, was they were allowed to go get him out. And I think I'd heard before it taught that there was a rope around the high priest, and that so that they could drag him out. I think that, if I'm not mistaken, I think that is actually just a tradition that was never confirmed, and so it's not actually something that actually took place. It's a Yes, it's a privilege to be in the presence of God, but it is also a scary, awe-inspiring thing, and I think that we need to think of that in terms of this body, or this temple as well. It is a privilege to be God's temple. Right. Yes. Right. Yes. Moses had a unique relationship with God. And do you remember uh, one of the problems with that? His appearance started bothering people because it was so bright. People couldn't look at him. And I don't remember if it was Jethro or Aaron or somebody else that came to Moses and said, "Hey, you're scaring everybody. Could you put a veil over your face or something like that when after you leave God's presence, to allow that to wear off, so that everybody can actually look at you?" I mean, that is such a thing that is hard for us to even imagine what that is like. And yet, today, because of the new covenant that we have in Jesus, because of the position that we are in as Christians, we have that kind of bond with our God. We are that temple. We are in God's presence. We need to remember that every day. All right, we're completely out of time. Let's have a prayer, and then we'll be dismissed for today.